So these patterns of inheritance were all discovered by a chap called Mendel, Gregor Mendel, who was a monk back in the 1800s, and back then the monks were the pinnacle of academic society, and they spent a lot of their time, obviously they were really living in silence, investigating and thinking about various different things. And he was looking at his plants, his pea plants that he was growing, and trying to understand why certain characteristics came and went as generations moved on. And he conducted a whole load of experiments using crossing thousands upon thousands of plants, and was able to make some predictions. And it's these predictions that we have just been looking at, and it's these predictions that they often like to ask you about in exam questions. So he started off by growing all his plants, and he was walking around and making various observations as to what was happening. And he noticed that plants were able to produce peas with different shaped outer coatings on them. They were either smooth coating or they were wrinkled. He did the same with the different heights of plants. Some plants were tall, some plants were dwarfed. And he was able to see that certain characteristics were stronger than others, and that's where this idea of dominant characteristics and recessive characteristics came about. Back then they didn't know about genes, they didn't know about DNA, they hadn't seen cells because microscopes hadn't been invented yet. So all he had was this idea, this concept that there were some packets of information that were being passed from one parent to their offspring. So for that reason he became known as the father of modern genetics, because he was able to think of this way before his time. His work was not published very well because people didn't really read the journals that he particularly published it in, and it was only much later on, once the discovery of DNA and the discovery of microscopes and the idea of cells were all able to be seen, people went back and looked at his work. So he found that he could breed pure breeding, so as the homozygous pea plants, and he did this because they were a discontinuous example of variation. They were either wrinkled or they were smooth. So what Mendel did, just as we've done with the brown eyes and the blue eyes, was that he conducted his cross, his monohybrid cross,